stressing yourself and the students out. Let's think about working with our collaborative planning partners to find the must-knows for this particular, unit of study. We need to recognize that we are in a pandemic. We need to emphasize that this is a historical period, and someday we're going to be telling our children that we lived through this. But we've all lived through it. And I think that next year or when they move on to another year, every educator is going to recognize that there may be gaps that they're going to have to fill in. And for example, last year's fifth graders, they went home on March 13th, and in Montgomery County, the fourth quarter deals with statistics in math. So we know that our fifth graders are coming to us with no knowledge of statistics. So the teachers of Math 6 are trying to build in opportunities to teach those indicators. And we're looking at diagnostics like the MAP-M and the MAP-R, which are what Montgomery County gives, to see where there are areas of need, and then having the teachers plan accordingly. But at the same time, I really do emphasize to my staff and to parents, we really do want to take care of the kids' mental health right now. We don't want to be, raising their anxiety about what they're missing academically, how they're falling behind. I know it's challenging when we're thinking about, some of you on this call probably have eighth graders or high schoolers that are taking credit-bearing classes like algebra, geometry, language. But every year I taught the same groups of children when I was a French teacher, and I would teach French 1, and then I'd come back to teach French 2, and I'd have to reteach things and remind students, and we're all going to recognize that. But on a more positive way of looking at it is, because of the situation that all educators have been thrown into, they are learning some really cool skills for blended learning and differentiation that will be able to be used once we're in the physical brick and mortar building again. They will be able to recognize that, Kathleen has not mastered this element of, doing decimals into fractions. And they'll be able to use some of these e-learning tools that we have become more comfortable with and continue to become more comfortable with, to say, okay, go work on this while I'm working in small groups. Because I don't know about you, and maybe it's just something that educators look at, but oftentimes we really want to move away from that sage on the stage of a teacher directed lesson and have students be able to work more independently in small groups. And the tools that we're gathering and using in this sort of virtual environment are going to be helpful in the classroom, so that a teacher will be able to work with small groups of students while other students are working independently. So yes, I do think there's a gap, but I do think that the emphasis has got to be taking care of ourselves, taking care of our children, relaxing, knowing that we're all in the same boat. And we're doing the best we can, just as our previous speaker said. We're all learning along the way, and trying to improve what we're doing and give our students what they need to the best we can without pressuring. There's a lot of pressure too.
Well, that kind of goes to the next thing I was going to ask, is how, as a parent, can I best facilitate and enhance? I've a dedicated space in the house. I set that up. We've heard that. What else can we be doing to help the teachers? Because I know they're bombarded, the kids are bombarded.
Yes, and there's so many emails and all of that. Yeah, and I do think that, I can see the struggles that people are having, and I hear the worries that are going on with our students. Parents are not only navigating how to get students to feel comfortable engaging in the virtual learning environment, they're also dealing with all of the sort of unrest in our society as well, and they have the loneliness of the isolation. They're feeling that they're missing. So it is a lot, and I do believe that our panelists today give great suggestions for how to seek out help, how to recognize the signs that students need some social emotional help. And I do feel fortunate that my children are grown now. And so I do feel that you all are faced with a new challenge. But, you know, our children are watching their teachers, they're watching you all the time, they're listening to us, and they're picking up on our vibe. And, you know, the same, you know, if we're feeling anxious, they're picking up on it. And so we do want to make sure that we're keeping ourselves positive, that we are also understanding balance for ourselves, but also for them. We're encouraging them when they aren't on screen to unplug from screens. You know, we want them to have that dedicated space at home. We want to have routines in place, just like normal school. I was talking to one of my colleagues who is working in central office, but her child goes to a private school in Prince George's County. And that school, they've started to come back with a hybrid model, but they've closed down again. But they insist that the children are in their uniform, even on screen, because then they're in that mindset. They're not in their PJs, under their blankets. And so you do want to encourage, get up, let's have breakfast, let's brush our teeth. Now it's time to go to our space that has everything that we need. And having those breaks in the day be true screen breaks. And, you know, I think just reviewing expectations and agreeing with your student about what are the can-dos when you're off screen and what are the must-dos. So, you know, maybe you want to make sure that they get up and walk around, and they, you know, do some physical activity. Have them reflect on how it feels when they're on the screen too much, to maybe motivate them to engage in other activities. And just, you know, trying to find those moments of joy during the day. And I think realizing that we should be grateful that we are safe and that we have these technology tools that are available to us, and that there's a lot of people working to help them, you know, that we've got a whole school community, a parent community.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. And next, I'm going to turn to Ms. Carloni. Hi. My question for you, this is a question I even had. You hear a lot on the news about helping your child develop resilience, and how, you know, if children can build resilience and coping mechanisms during this time, it's going to benefit them so much. But could you kind of explain to some of the parents and me what this resilience is that they're talking about, and how it's going to benefit the children coming through the pandemic and everything going on in society right now?
Sure. I think about resilience in terms of thinking about it like a balance board, or teeter-totter, if you will, with a fulcrum in the middle. And if you think about one side of that of being the things that are stacked against you, whether it is some families that may have some vulnerable people in the families, you're dealing with social distancing, you're dealing with, in some families, having financial concerns, job loss, other sources of stress. So that's on one side. And on the other side, you have some of your protective factors. Maybe you are fortunate to be a financially stable family with housing and supportive relationships. And those things are the protective factors. So you've got, on the one hand, the issues, the barriers, and then the other hand, the strengths. And then in the middle, you have the fulcrum that determines how that balances out. And that fulcrum is made up of your executive functioning, your core skills, emotional skills, physical skills, psychological skills. And in those, everyone's fulcrum is in a different place. And so what you bring to the table in terms of those skills, your core skills, determines the degree to which the negatives, the barriers, outweigh the strengths. So when we think about how we can work on resilience, it's about those core emotional and psychological skills. It's about emotional flexibility. It's about utilization of the resources that you have and shoring up some of the ones that you might not have.
So how can parents help children with this? risks right now?
So some of the things that I think of were a lot of the things that Dr. Smith brought up were really important. I think having structure is vital. Having balance between making sure that there's physical movement every day. I think also staying on track with nutrition, hydration, some of those things. Making children feel part of the collective, I think, is important too. So at their level, explaining how what we do is helping everyone else. Like mask using,
like when we wear our masks,
we're helping
everyone
else. Developmentally appropriate conversations, I think a very important thing, as well as I think it's helpful in families to have family meetings, and they I think I provided in the resources a little family meeting structure, which can be helpful. And it might,
wonderful.
It might include something like sharing gratitude with your family members, talking about the week ahead, talking about some of the expectations, and maybe even addressing some of the barriers. What went well last week? What went poorly? Lots of things improve.
I love the idea of addressing gratitude, especially with Thanksgiving coming up. I mean, that would be, I can see how that would be wonderful for elementary kids, middle school. I mean, I can see how you could really use that. That's wonderful to remind them of everything good in our lives.
And it is demonstrated to strengthen people emotionally when they are more aware of what some of those strengths and blessings are. I think also some families are going to be more impacted than others. So families where there might be a job loss, or there might be essential workers, families where you've got maybe dual income earners and then more than one child who is doing online schooling. It's, there's specific struggles depending on who you are, and reaching out to some outside sources of help can be really helpful. We talked a little bit about therapy being available in the community, but in addition to that, if you have family members who have significant mental health concerns, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, NAMI.org, is a great organization, very, very helpful.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you, Ms. Carloni. I'm going to go on to Dr. Matheson, and I'm sure we'll be speaking again soon. Okay. Hi, Dr. Matheson.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. The first question I have for you is multi-pronged. They go together, so I'm going to give you them both. What are the key health risks facing children with COVID-19? And then like the second half, if you could touch on what is unique about the spread of disease in children versus adults.
Okay. There hasn't been too much proven to be, as far as health risks in kids, for the most part, it is a pretty benign illness in children. The biggest risk is spreading it to other populations where there is potential more risk. So even though I think we think of a lot of comorbid conditions and asthma and things potentially being high risk, haven't necessarily proven that. I mean, there's some literature that says that young infants potentially are at more risk. And I think that's true of any infection in a young infant. Is certainly a higher risk population. But in general, there aren't too many risk factors in kids that potentially predispose them to becoming sicker than others, other than, severe, conditions like a cancer or another thing that would make someone susceptible from any virus. But for the most part, the biggest risk in children for coronavirus is really spreading it. So it's not just spreading it to adults, it's spreading it in the communities. And, we stress, obviously, social distancing and hand washing and masking. So I think part of our job is education, that how important those things are, when it wasn't commonplace before to be sanitizing before and after you get on playground equipment, and to be wearing a mask in classroom, and to get used to what plexiglass barriers are and why they're important. And instead of single file line, it's a spaced out 6-foot single file line that, that goes all the way down the hallway.
Yeah, and I have to give the children credit. They've been doing great on the social distancing, because I found it hard as an adult. I mean, asking children to do this is hard.
Yes. Well, what was the second part of your question? Say again.
I'm sorry. The second part, with the children, I just want to clarify, that's for like under the age group of 12. Like teens, you can run into different, am I wrong? I've heard reports in the news that teens can develop infection more similar to adults.
No, I mean, the biggest spreaders, so I work for a company that's across the country, and we've actually done more COVID testing. So we have a good understanding of who's really getting this and who's spreading it.
Right.
And it's definitely the 12 to 30-year-old. They really have some of the highest percentages of positivity and are also some of the highest spreaders. But it doesn't mean that in that older child, they can potentially become sicker. So it really is, the biggest risk is spread of disease.
Okay, in the younger age group. Okay. So then that kind of leads into my next question for you was, could you review some of the concepts and principles about COVID testing, such as who should be tested, when, what are the triggers, and then what type of tests should parents be asking for if they do think, hey, I need to bring my kid in for a test? Because I know there are multiple different types of COVID tests now. From my children's school is required a COVID test weekly. They do a hybrid.
And I think it's one of the biggest misconceptions that, there's a lot of information out there, and the examples we're following aren't necessarily the examples being put forth by, the medical nomenclature and the CDC and what we think is the, appropriate steps, and the White House was an example. There was a lot of, after President Trump got it and everybody was getting antigen tests, and the antigen tests were criticized. You have organizations like Major League Baseball that were doing rapid tests every single day. And there was a New York Times article pointing out how there were problems with the rapid tests. So there are different tests. There's a rapid antigen test where you can get a result in about 15 minutes. There's a PCR test that usually takes a couple days. And then there's antibody tests, which are blood tests, which looks for previous infection, but not current infection. So the gold standard for everything is really that PCR test. It typically takes a couple days to get the result, but it really it's a molecular test that really looks for evidence of the virus for the entire life cycle of the virus. Symptoms, if it's after you have symptoms, if you happen to be one of those people who doesn't get symptoms with this and is a spreader, it picks up the disease pretty well. There's another test that's a rapid antigen test, which I think everybody wants to be the right answer because you get a quick result. Unfortunately, it isn't a very good test unless you actually have symptoms. So people that have symptoms, it's actually a really good test. And it's kind of like the flu test, that you wouldn't do a flu test on somebody that didn't have any symptoms. And it's the same thing for this. So the rapid test is actually very, very good for people who have symptoms, who are sick. But if you don't have symptoms and you're in contact with somebody, the rapid test just doesn't pick up the virus at the right stage, and it has a high false negative rate. So it's sort of using the right test at the right time. I think one of the other misconceptions about testing is exposure. So the definition of contact exposure, it means that you were within 6 feet of somebody. It doesn't really specify whether you're wearing a mask or not. It doesn't specify whether you're inside or outside, but that's what we really consider a close contact exposure. And if that's the case, the rules are to quarantine for 14 days. And it's advised to go get testing. And if you get a test, though, you have to wait about 4 or 5 days after the exposure to get the test, because there's a time lapse and there's an incubation period of the virus. So, and I think that's challenging because some people get a rapid test. They were exposed to someone yesterday. They have it. I was just with them, and people rush to get a test, and it's just too early. And then I think.
So I just wanted, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to make sure I'm hearing what you're saying correctly. So in other words, when you want to get that PCR test, it's 5 days after exposure is when you'd want to get that PCR. That's the gold.
Correct. If you do it for symptoms, it can happen anytime. If somebody's sick, a PCR is a great test. If you're doing it for an exposure for someone that doesn't have symptoms, but you're exposed to somebody, yeah, the advice is to wait.
Okay, great. And I had another question that was kind of off of the COVID. I was just curious, since you are in urgent care, are you seeing, because of the pandemic, that parents are putting off some of the routine preventative care that maybe would keep kids out of the urgent care? Or like they're afraid to go to the pediatricians, so maybe they ran out of their hours. Parents should be taking their kids in for routine visits.
Yeah, and I think it's hard because I think a lot of those routine visits are different. That they some people are delaying immunizations. There were concerns that there were going to be measles outbreaks again because a lot of people weren't getting their children vaccinated, just like you're not going to the dentist or not getting your car fixed. I think it's no different. There are interesting studies about things like appendicitis, which has nothing to do with COVID and is a common problem in adults and children. And the rates haven't necessarily changed, but the complications have because people wait longer and longer to go in. And I think we see the same with children. It's taking longer to pick up new diagnoses. We're seeing some effects of lack of preventive care, especially for things that need in-person therapies like immunizations or other medications.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I am going to move on now to Miss Pomerantz. Hi. I wanted to ask you about our children's social well-being, social interactions. I know with my own children, especially being in that middle school age, how are you seeing that quarantine and, remote learning is affecting our children socially, and how can we support our children?
So it's a good question, and I think it's a question that's on every parent and educator's mind, right? That what's the impact of online learning on our children's well-being? And so I think there's some positives, and I think that there's some negatives. I think that the negative impact of remote learning on socialization seems somewhat obvious, right? Disconnection with peers and with, school, adults that students see at school, and they're just not seeing the variety of people on a daily basis that they would if they were in the building. I think students are missing their friends, and I think they're missing out on opportunities to make new friends. I think it's particularly hard for those students who are starting, a new school, like 6th grade, 9th graders, or transfer students, right? So they're just, if they're online, it's just, they're not learning, they're not having the opportunity to make new friends. I think that another negative impact is the formal means of connecting with their peers through teams or clubs or after school activities, right? These are typically structured social opportunities to talk to people that you might not consider in your friend group, but are people you would interact with, their acquaintances, their teammates, or also to connect with people who have the shared common interest. And I think that there's a negative impact on the informal means of connecting with peers, right? So like if you're in class and you just ask your neighbor a question about the assignment, it's just like a formal, or seeing your friends in the hallway, or hanging out, with friends in, you pass your friends in somewhere in a hallway in a corner, and you're sort of like catching up on the tea, catching up on the, the information, right? So these are informal opportunities that are just not happening. On the other side, and I do like to try, I know Dahlia's and others mentioned balance is important, right? I like to see the positive impact of remote learning. For some, the reduced distractions from the social, from the peer pressures, and from the transitions from class to class can actually help students. It can help them focus better on their academics. I've seen clients with improved grades, better grades than they've ever had. I think it can diminish some anxiety. I think it can keep some students out of trouble, actually, potentially. I think it's also an opportunity to practice uncomfortable social skills, so that we can get better at some of the social skills that feel awkward. Like, for example, the breakout rooms. I think that, teachers are trying to use breakout rooms to make the smaller learning. And for a lot of kids, that's like, very awkward and very hard. They don't know somebody. And so that, or, having to do the emailing and reaching out to teachers, it's more effort, and they can't just sort of informally ask the teacher. So I think those are uncomfortable but useful social skills to be building, builds self-esteem, builds mastery, and it can manage our anxiety if we're not avoiding, so it kind of forces us to do that. I think then also becoming independent, maybe becoming more independent learners, is another positive impact of online learning. So.
Thank you so much. Okay. We're going to now open this up to audience questions. So again, I'll say please type your questions into the chat box. If you would like to direct your question to a specific panelist, please include their name in the question. The first question I have for the panel generally, so panelists, do you have any idea when the pandemic will be under control and kids can return to school and parents can return to work? This is something I know all of us want to have answered. Does anyone want to wade into this? Maybe Dr. Mathis?
I can say something not about when the pandemic will be under control, but it is an interesting experience that I, as a school building leader, am in right now, because as you've probably, if your children are in Montgomery County public schools, there's discussion now about bringing some groups of students back to the building on January 12th and others by second semester, February 2nd about. And so part of my work is to prepare the building for this return. But it's interesting to be spending time thinking of traffic patterns and signage when at the same time we're hearing about the numbers going up and the timing of potential vaccinations. So my gut tells me that while there might be some small groups coming back to Montgomery County, I think it will be the fall, so fall of 2021. But I don't know that. I would love to have the students in the building because it is not the same this way, but it is definitely a period of cognitive dissonance with the two. You're hearing one thing in one place, but you're being asked to do something in another. And I do think part of that we have to recognize is that we have a teaching staff that ranges in age with pre-existing health conditions. And so how do you bring certain staff back and not certain staff? So I think they are surveying to get an idea of the numbers of people that would like their children to return to the building. And then the same thing with the staff. They're trying to get the staff to indicate whether they would need some kind of accommodations. It would require, I think, if students come back, that there would maybe be a change in their teacher or their schedule because it's now going to be a different setup. So, but I don't really have the answer. We need a magic ball, I think.
I think we all want that one answered. Would any of the other panelists like to weigh in? Okay, moving on. I have a question from the audience for Dr. Matheson. Oh, this is interesting. What can parents do in terms of prevention other than hand washing and mask wearing? For example, there have been news stories about zinc and vitamin D in the news. Is this something parents should be giving to children?
It's a great question. I mean, there's elderberry and there's all sorts of other supplements that people talk about. The reality is that masks 100% work. And universal masking would do wonders locally and for the country. There's no question. I can tell you that our own staff that have been swabbing kids and adults with COVID who are coughing for the past 6 months Our own staff have not gotten sick, knock on wood, but for the most part, and that's not necessarily with extensive PPE, at times it is, but on routine care of people that are going in and working every day with people who have COVID, and they're wearing masks, the disease isn't being transmitted. So, I mean, the simplest, easiest thing is really attention to mask wearing at all ages, and it's absolutely doable in kids over 2. There's plenty of 2.5, 3, 4-year-olds that do it just fine. So the misconceptions that kindergartners and kids can't do it, I mean, it's that, I think that's more about the individual child and maybe other problems with that child, and not necessarily that it's a difficult task. I have twin kindergartners. They love wearing their masks. Sometimes I have to remind them to take their masks off, and it's a different age because now they're used to this almost as a normal, which is sad, but it's true. But that mask wearing is so critically important. You know, as far as supplements, things like zinc and vitamin D has always been shown to have some potential immunoprotective qualities. So there's definitely people that do take vitamin D. It's never really anything that's proven that, or that necessarily has said that if you take this, you will not get sick. And there's no vitamin that's ever going to do that, or has ever been proven to do it. But it certainly isn't wrong to give vitamins. I just wouldn't expect them to prevent disease or expect anyone to get better faster because they're taking 5 Flintstone vitamins a day.
Thank you. The next question is to the panel, and it's kind of it's a good one. I've had this as well. As far as supporting your child, social, emotional, mental health, what should parents not do? I mean, what should we not be doing?
I'll take this one. I think one of the things that we should not be doing is letting our own kind of overblown fears and things be a part of the dinner table conversation. So we need to be managing our own mental health, and to the extent that we also do the things that we know are not good for us, like doom scrolling on social media and so on, trying to get those things under control on our own behalf and the behalf of our family members. And then the other thing that I would say is also adjusting your expectations. So addressing some of what Dr. Smith was about, that there likely will be some learning gaps, there likely will be some issues along the way. I think we can expect, myself, I have a middle schooler and a high schooler at home. So, we're thinking about things like college. And I think colleges are going to be pretty wise to the idea. If they see a grade drop in 2020, that will not surprise them when they're evaluating applicants. So I think adjusting expectations and making those in line with reality.
Wonderful. All right, I like this question. I didn't think of it, but I really like it. To the panel, any advice on the proper amount of screen time for children? Is there a difference when screen time is social, like Zooming with friends, versus solo gaming? Dr. Topolowski.
I don't think there's an exact answer to this. I think every child is different. My kids, I have 4, range from 16 down to 9. So I don't think there's one answer for this. I think you really have to see, is your child able to balance, their academics and also have time for social? But I think it's really important that you find that we just have to sort of readjust our expectations for screen time. At least we've had to do that in our family. It used to be before 2020. There was no playing video games and doing certain things during the week at all. It was just like on weekends. And we've totally shifted, because if I don't allow my children to have that time, whether they're playing video games or texting with friends, I see that they're really lonely and struggling to connect. So I do think we have to sort of change our expectations when it comes to figuring out how much screen time that we are allowing our children. And yes, to encourage them not just to play video games alone, but to find ways for them to really interact with their friends. There's so many different ways, not just with video games, just with chatting or watching a movie together. Or my child the other week had a virtual sleepover with a friend. They had to like go to bed at a certain time, but when they woke up and the iPad was not in their bed or anything, but they would,
Mhm.
they could check on each other in the morning, and they watched a movie together. It was very cute because she really misses sleepovers.
Right.
So just really readjusting your expectations while at the same time, obviously having limits is obviously important.
Oh, I have to say on my child's phone, I gave her unlimited FaceTime with her friends, and then I limited the gaming to like an hour. Mean mom, what can I say? Okay, the next question is to the whole panel again. What is Montgomery County doing well for academics and medicine, and what are they not doing as well? Very broad.
I can talk a little bit about, I think that what they have done well is adjust expectations and communicated different expectations to staff in between when we first closed in the spring, where it was a primarily asynchronous experience, meaning students would have assignments pushed out to them and they might go to one check-in a week with a teacher, to have provided expectations of using one platform rather than multiple platforms. So everyone's using my MCPS Classroom, which is essentially Canvas. So that has helped streamline what the student and the parent experience. They've provided a lot of professional learning, which is overwhelming sometimes, but we also have been able to provide a lot of different online tools like Pear Deck and other ways to engage our students. But I think one of the most important professional learning opportunities we've given to our staff is to teach them the importance of that social presence in the online learning environment, learning your students' names, saying hello to them, providing some time at the beginning and end of class to just talk and the way you would as students walk into the classroom, and to provide them those opportunities in the breakout rooms. And I loved what Phyllis said about, those learning those uncomfortable skills. This is the upside of this experience. Students are becoming more independent, more resilient. We're doing lessons on how do you write an email to the teacher so that it makes sense and they know who you are. And I think it's also good for students, for people, for individuals to know that life is not always going to be easy and it's going to be a challenge, and it's how you approach challenge and adversity and learn from it and move forward. So I think we do a lot of lessons on mindset or communications about mindset. So I think they're doing that well. What I think is not so great is that even with the schedule that we have, which allows more time, FaceTime with teachers, as I sort of alluded to earlier, they have not collapsed down the curriculum expectations. And so that has created a lot of stress where I'm sure some of you have students that are receiving 1 million math assignments in 1 week because they're supposed to get through what they normally would do in 5 days of lessons in 2-hour periods. And so that, I think, we are looking at now as we enter second quarter. The middle school principals all advocated strongly to the higher ups and the curriculum office that something has to be done. I also don't think that giving too many standardized tests like the progress checks, that's not really the way to gauge learning right now. And it takes up time and causes anxiety and stress. And so I think that looking at different ways to assess student mastery that does not cause that stress or take away so much time in a weird environment, it's not really an accurate assessment. So that's some of the things that I think we're doing well, and what we're not doing well. So.
Actually, this is a great follow-up question to that, and this is for our mental health experts. Please ask the therapists if they're seeing patients with school stress. Phyllis, or who would like to wave your hand? Who would like to take first?
I can.
Okay.
I think that generally stress level is up. So the academic stress, I think that it's in the spring, last spring, there was, this drop off, and there was so much confusion and frustration. And then I think, ideally it would be great if we were back. But I think what's been happening this semester, this quarter so far, has been, definitely better than what it was in the spring, and obviously not as ideal as it would be if they were back in the building, especially for, I have a middle schooler and a high schooler. My high schooler is taking lots of AP classes. I think some of those expectations have not been adjusted. And so if they have 2 hours of learning, they're still required. And the stress level is high. I'm hearing that from my clients. I'm hearing that from my daughter. And I think that, it's challenging. And as a parent, I think and add to that, when they're younger, parents do intervene more and might advocate for their students. But high schoolers, teachers don't want to hear from the parents, and we want those kids to have those skills. So it's about encouraging, I think, your student or your clients to be assertiveness type skills, advocate for yourself, talk it through, give permission to do less in other areas. I think the fact that there isn't the structured sports, we're not running around, doing a million different activities, helps reduce the overall stress. But I think, that is reality. So I'm really glad to hear, Dr. Smith, that that's being looked at for, overall that's being considered. But obviously any de-stressing types of things, exercise, yoga, mindfulness. I really like I really like things like rituals for families and friends. So if I work with mostly adolescents, so I think it's really important that to encourage ways to have connections, build memories through those kinds of, whether it's a Zoom call or it's a picnic in the park, but to not, and creativity, right? So to encourage that connection and to try and build in routine in those connections can build some rituals. And I think that it's making lemonade as best as we can.
Dr.
Or
Topolowski?
I just wanted to say two things. One is that I think that a lot of people, even though they're not in school, there's a lot of social exclusion still going on, and that's stemming from my experience with, there are families in pods with other families. So I know for people who aren't in pods or aren't getting together, I know sometimes my kids will see on social media, this one and this one had a sleepover, but we're not doing that yet. And they're in a pod and they're allowed, but we're not. And so a lot of times, one of my children actually said to me the other day, I think a pod is another name for a cliff. And of course, that's not intentional, but that's her experience of it, because it ends up becoming, it feels exclusional to her. So that's one thing I wanted to sort of bring up, that I think kids are also, yes, there's the academic stress, but aside from just the loneliness, what ends up happening is also sometimes this unintentional exclusion. And the other thing I wanted to bring up that I noticed in my own personal life, and then I recently spoke to adolescents about this at a school virtually, which was the lack of what I'm calling transitional space. And so for me, transitional space used to be even though I had a very short drive to work, it was still like 8 minutes where I was able to sort of put aside whatever dynamics happened with my family that morning and think about who were my clients and patients that I was about to see, and sort of get in a different mindset. And in between clients, sort of process and think about, our sessions, and then my drive home, sort of what am I going to leave behind and what am I going to bring into my family. And so I spoke to a bunch of teenagers about how are you missing that lack of transitional space right now? And so many of them really related to that concept, because they're going, most of them are not even eating breakfast. I mean, a lot of them are just literally their alarm and then it's Zoom school. There's no transition. Or they're going, and I know for myself, right, I go from my Zoom therapy room to oh shoot, I have to, it's time for dinner with my family, and I open my office door and I run into dinner. like I've had no time to process, they're having no time to process. So one of the things that I know I'm working on and that I also could recommend for parents to work on with their children is how can you build in that transitional space into this virtual world? And one thing could be, you know, I know for myself, maybe it means going into my office 5 minutes earlier or taking 5 minutes after I'm done with a session before rushing into my family. No, I'm not robbing my family of 5 minutes of myself. What I'm doing is preparing so that I could bring the energy and what I want to bring into my family in a much better way than just like rushing from work and not having time to recenter and reset myself. So that's also just, you know, a recommendation to work. How can you bring in transitional space for yourself as a parent, and how can you help your children sort of create that?
I love that. I definitely need it. Ms. Carloni, did you want to add?
I'll just add one other item that I work with a lot of teenagers in in my therapy practice. And one of my first questions when kids are reporting a lot of academic stress is I do ask the question about their sleep schedule and whether they're getting quality sleep, restorative sleep. That is a huge factor in what's going on. And then secondarily, I always ask the question about whether or not they are getting any kind of analog time, expressive time, if they're getting out of their rooms. There's a lot of kids that eat in their room. They are basically in their room from the moment they open their eyes to the moment their eyes shut. And that's just really not a helpful thing academically or emotionally. So I really pay attention to those couple of things.
Well, actually, that's really helpful because the next question I have is specifically for you, Ms. Carloni, and it is, does online therapy benefit teens? Could you explain how it works? And what are some of the warning signs parents should look for?
Sure. So
your child needs help, I guess.
Yeah. Online therapy really does work. There's a lot of pretty robust research around it, typically more with adults, but in terms of the research. But in my experience with the kids that I'm working with, it does work. It's especially if they are able to feel like they have adequate privacy. And it's made very simple with lots of handy apps and things like that, you know, just like with Zoom, the HIPAA compliant apps that are used for therapy are very simple to use, and you know, always having a backup or two to make that much easier. I think one of the benefits of having that opportunity to see kids, that kids a lot of times will show you their home environment. So they'll share their pet with you, they'll share their bedroom with you, what's on the wall. It does provide a lot of comfort to them to be able to share that inner world a little bit in that way. And in terms of things to look out for, obviously you're going to be looking out for changes in eating patterns, sleeping patterns. Are kids seeming depressed or low mood objectively from the outside? Are they expressing any kind, an increased level of negativity? Are there, you know, is there evidence of suicidal ideation going on? Are you aware of some change or friendship in their social groups? Things like that can be a really big trigger for teens, especially.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Smith, for you, how is Montgomery County reaching out to
Laurie,
parents about what's going on?
Here, you want to see David Matheson when he comes on?
So there have been surveys sent out. Most recently, the survey is most surveys have gone out to parents. Sometimes the wording, I think, doesn't make it particularly helpful in terms of trying to be actionable. So a lot of the principals, we work together, and right now at my school, we're doing aligned surveys where we're asking essentially the same questions to the staff, the students, and the parents. And then we'll look at that and sort of triangulate and see, you know, what we can improve on. I think that's the most helpful, is on a school by school basis to see what's going on and what your individual school community needs. I did want to say something about the academic stress that I think has definitely contributed to some of my students' academic stress, is that one of the guidelines for distance learning was not to give as many graded assignments. Well, if you don't give as many graded assignments, then say you have 8 assignments and you've missed one completely because it got lost in all of the flurry of a million different classes and assignments. It's a 0 that takes your grade down to a grade you've never seen. Whereas if you were in the building, the teacher would have been like, you know, hey, Karen, aren't you going to turn that in? And there is a lot of communication, but because of all of those emails, sometimes things get lost. And I've had conversations with students in the last couple of weeks, and they've all sort of reflected that, you know, I'm going to do better, because sometimes, just like adults, I think it's human nature that, you know, sometimes you just don't want to deal with things and you put your head in the sand. And I think with all of the emails that students were receiving and assignments and keeping up with the adjustment this quarter, sometimes it's like they're like, oh, I didn't turn in that and I didn't turn in that, and now I've got a C. I haven't had a C or a D, you know, and then that raises their stress. But what I would say to you as parents is to, especially in middle school and not the AP classes and not the high school credit classes, who cares? You know, if it's a C or a D, who cares? We want a happy child that still likes learning. And that's the same thing I said to the teachers. Give them opportunities to experience success. Jamming all of this curriculum down their throat is going to make them think they're bad at school, they hate school, they don't like learning, they don't want to do it. And we have to remember that we have to keep the seed of positivity about their academic identity alive. So that's something that I try to keep in perspective. They're 11, 12, and 13 years old. Let's let them continue to like learning, you know, and try and make things. And somebody had put something in the chat about the opportunity for socializing online. I think it is great. And some of the teachers even built that in as well. So I think that's different from gaming alone. You know, I did want to.
That was going to be my next question. you jumped the question. I love it. But in case someone missed it in the chat, the question was, do you consider gaming on video games a healthy form of socialization? Would anyone else like to add to that? If they're playing with other
people, it is somewhat.
Okay. Wonderful.
I think that there's a difference between the social type of social media and gaming, and then the alone, the Netflix for hours and hours, episode after episode. You know, as parents, we just thought screen time was bad, but especially with our adolescents who their need for their social interaction is, you know, sort of, you know, the cornerstone of the stage of development. I think we have to rebalance our view of it, and just as parents, we want to discourage the alone time and be supportive, and maybe even stretch our own comfort level, you know, about social media platforms. I mean, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat are some of the more obvious ones, and I think that for you know, sort of anxious parents who might be more prone to restricting that, saying no, there's a lot of fear and danger, that I would encourage parents to do some research and find out if those are just fears, or if that, you know, get more factual information about the dangers, because there's certainly ways to guide your student. You can follow a student, your child, you can follow, you know, that might be a criteria that you can give the platform to your child if you're allowed to follow them. And the value of that now in this, you know, time frame where they are isolated, I think we as adults have to just have a new perspective on that difference. Like, the need for the connection is really important. And then I think the rules can, you know, limit the alone stuff, but be more encouraging. So yeah.
Would anyone like to add to that question? Very good. Okay. Dr. Matheson, I have a question for you. With all this talk over and over again about all this screen time the kids are getting, what can we do to keep them active in winter with deconditioning and just the eye strain from all the screen time? Should we be getting our kids, you know, even if they don't have vision problems, glasses for blue light? Because you hear about these things on the web. Do we really need this? I mean, should we do that? Could you speak about some of the screen time?
I mean,
and what
as
we
far
can
as
do?
activity, in winter, that there's a lot of activities that are okay because they're outside. And there is some truth to that, these outdoor activities are probably relatively safer. You know, although even things like swimming is a relatively safe sport indoors. It's not the time in the pool that's unsafe. It's the time in the locker room before and afterwards. So I think as far as activities, it doesn't mean that you can't do activities in the winter, but it is hard to assess what activities we consider safe and what activities we consider unsafe. But I think as parents, you know, I have 3 kids. I think we can all be creative on developing what those activities are to keep our kids active. So as soon as it gets cold, it doesn't mean they're locked to the screen for an extra 3 hours a day. And I think there are a lot of different activities that you can do that are safe, that can be adjusted for the winter time. But it is going to be more difficult to do that. You know, as far as your second question about, you know, are there different glasses and things to wear, I actually don't know very well. I mean, the resolution on monitors today, I think we have to remember how much better and brighter and cleaner it is than it was 15 years ago. So there is a lot of attention that actually there's less strain on the eyes with some of the newer, higher pixelated monitors than there was in years past. But if we're stuck staring at them for longer periods in a very young age, is that going to have more deleterious effects? I don't think we know yet. And we certainly don't know about what happens to a first grader who's staring at a monitor for 10 hours a day, because that never happened before. So I think there's a lot of things with this pandemic we just don't have the answers to.
Okay. There is another question I'd like to present to our mental health experts. I think it's really important. Someone asked, how do they get recommendations for therapists that take private insurance? Like, how do parents go about looking for this? Is it in the resources that are on our website? Are there lists that parents can go to?
I think parents can start with their school counselors. I think parents can go to the, you know, Psychology Today is a really easy website to find, you know, sort of do a filter and query and find, you know, maybe good matches. I don't think that's changed. I think that's always been the case. And I think, you know, we obviously want people to reach out. And so, you know, asking, just sort of speaking up and asking around. But I think starting at school counselors, and then a pediatrician, and then going from there.
Question, I believe this is for Dr. Smith, because it says, are impoverished students in our community getting computers?
Yes, every child has a Chromebook, and over the summer they were allowed to keep them, and then they upgraded them for elementary to make them touch screens so people could swap them out. And then the middle schoolers, we encouraged them to use a school device because it does limit their access to things so that they're more focused during class time. But I do think that's something that Montgomery County has done very well. Now, a lot of us had to be involved in that. We did Chromebook distributions at our school. We continue to get them, you know, broken ones returned, and then they replaced them immediately. So yeah, that's been huge. And I think it's moving to the point that when we come back to school, because I received a pallet, I didn't even know I was getting a pallet of cases, you know, thousands, or not thousands, but I have 1,200 students, so 1,200 cases. So I think what's going to happen is that when the students come back, it'll be a one-on-one device that you carry around with you all day and take home with you at night. So that's a difference from, you know, previous years.
Wonderful. I've been informed 1 or 2 people are trying to ask questions, and the devices they're on don't allow them to answer the questions into chat. So we're going to unmute them and let them address the panel. Oh, please, when you want to ask a question, unmute yourself. Or could you try asking the question again? We didn't get it. No. Okay. One last request for anyone who wants to unmute themselves and ask a question. Now is the time. No? Okay. Well, it looks like we've run out of our questions for today. And I'm gonna wrap up then. And I would like to thank all of our panelists for their participation. A special thank you goes out to Jacqueline Hume, who handled the technical aspects of today's roundtable, along with my husband in the background, passing me the note cards. I'd also like to thank the audience for their insightful and engaging questions. Please go to our website to review the resources provided by our panelists. And while you are there, if you could please consider donating to Peace Mountain Theater Company so that we can continue to offer free programming like today's presentation, we would appreciate it. A note to our audience, our next PMTC online event is The Other, an interactive children's play taking place on Sunday, January 24th at 4 p.m. And thank you all for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.